every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It is just past 10 in the morning on January 15, 1947. Los Angeles is a city running on pure, uncut ambition. The war is over, and the GIs are home, flooding into Southern California with money in their pockets and a future to build. The citrus groves that once defined the landscape are being bulldozed to make way for suburbs. The studios are churning out films that will define a generation. It is a city of blinding sunlight and deep shadows, a place where a farm girl from Ohio can be discovered at a soda counter one day and be a star the next. This is the promise, the glittering bait. But beneath the surface, the city is a labyrinth of corruption, a place where studio fixers, mobsters, and dirty cops operate in a symbiotic ecosystem of secrets and lies. It is a city on the make and on the edge. In the quiet, developing neighborhood of Leimert Park, a young mother named Betty Bersinger is pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller along the sidewalk of Norton Avenue. The air is cool and crisp, the kind of California winter morning that feels clean and full of possibility. The street is lined with modest homes, but there are still gaps, vacant lots waiting for the city's inexorable sprawl to fill them in. As Betty walks, her eyes catch something in one of these lots, a patch of overgrown weeds and discarded debris. It's pale, almost unnaturally white against the damp, dark earth. Her first thought, a logical one, is that it's a discarded mannequin, the kind you see broken and tossed out from a department store window display. It's in 2 pieces, severed neatly at the waist, one half lying a foot or so away from the other. An odd sight, but this is a city of oddities. She steers the stroller a little closer, her curiosity piqued, and then the details begin to resolve, to sharpen into an undeniable horror. The gentle curve of a hip, the unmistakable shape of a human breast, the waxy, pallid texture of skin. Her mind struggles to process the image. This is no mannequin. This is a woman displayed like a piece of broken statuary. The scream that leaves Betty Bersinger's throat is swallowed by the vast, indifferent blue of the California sky. She grabs her child, a frantic instinct to shield her from the sight, and runs to the nearest house, banging on the door, her words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent wave of terror. Soon, the quiet suburban street is filled with the sound of sirens, a rising and falling wail that marks the beginning of a story that will curdle the city's dreams into a permanent nightmare. A story that will outlive detectives, suspects, and witnesses, embedding itself into the very fabric of American crime lore. The woman in the lot was Elizabeth Short, but the world would soon come to know her by a different name, a name crafted by newsmen and whispered in smoky bars, a name that would eclipse the person entirely, turning her into a symbol, a puzzle, a ghost. The Black Dahlia. For over 75 years, her case has remained the most infamous unsolved murder in the annals of American crime. But the mystery is not just who killed her. The deeper mystery is why we are still so captivated by it. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a modern myth. How a brutal killing, a city's dark secrets, a flawed investigation, and a ravenous media machine conspired to erase a woman and create an icon of tragedy, forever haunting the city of angels. To truly understand the anatomy of the Black Dahlia myth, we must first perform an act of resurrection. We must exhume the woman from beneath the legend. Elizabeth Short was not born a noir heroine. She was born in Hyde Park, a neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, on July 29, 1924, to Cleo and Phoebe May Short. She was the third of 5 daughters, a middle child in a bustling, all-female household. Her father, Cleo, was a man who chased the American dream with inventive flair. He built and sold miniature golf courses, a business that rode the wave of the roaring 20s. But that wave crashed hard against the shore of the 1929 stock market crash, and the Short family's fortunes were wiped out along with so many others. One day in 1930, Cleo Short's car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge. A note was found, suggesting profound despair. The logical conclusion, the one the family accepted with grim resignation, was that he had taken his own life, another casualty of the Great Depression's cruel calculus. Phoebe Short was left to raise 5 girls alone, a monumental task in an era of crushing poverty. She took a job as a bookkeeper and managed to keep her family together, instilling in her daughters a sense of resilience. Elizabeth, however, faced an additional challenge. From a young age, she was plagued by severe asthma and bronchial infections. The cold, damp New England winters were a constant torment, confining her to bed for weeks at a time. She was a strikingly beautiful child, with luminous pale blue eyes, a full mouth, and a cascade of dark hair. But her physical frailty shaped her world, fostering an interior life rich with dreams of escape. Her escape was the cinema. At the local movie theater, she could lose herself in worlds far from the chill of Medford. She saw women on screen who were healthy, glamorous, and adored. They lived in a place called California, a sun-drenched paradise where it was never cold, a place where dreams, it seemed, were not just possible but probable. California became more than a destination. It was a panacea, a cure for both her physical ailments and the quiet desperation of her small-town life. The first great trauma of her life, her father's presumed suicide, was upended by a second, perhaps even more destabilizing one. 12 years later, in 1942, a letter arrived. It was from Cleo Short. He was not at the bottom of the Charles River. He was alive and well, living in Vallejo, California, and working at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. The suicide had been a fabrication, a desperate man's escape from the crushing weight of debt and family responsibility. After a decade of silence, he now wanted to reconnect with his children. For 19-year-old Elizabeth, the letter was more than a shock. It was a golden ticket. Her mother, understandably, wanted little to do with the man who had abandoned her and her daughters. But for Elizabeth, Cleo was a lifeline to the place she'd always dreamed of. In late 1942, she packed her bags and boarded a train heading west. The reunion, however, was not the idyllic new beginning she had imagined. California was as sunny as advertised, but life with her father was tense. Cleo was a frugal, disciplined, and controlling man. He expected his daughter to be a demure homemaker, to cook and clean and live a quiet life. Elizabeth, tasting true freedom for the first time, had other ideas. She was a young woman on the cusp of her 20s, eager to explore the world, to go to dances, to listen to jazz, to meet the handsome servicemen who filled the streets of wartime California. The clash was inevitable. After just a few months of escalating arguments, Cleo kicked her out. This moment, in early 1943, marks the beginning of Elizabeth Short's transient life, a 4-year period that would later be sensationalized by the press as a sordid tale of aimless wandering and moral decay. The reality was far more complex. It was the life of a young, single woman without a safety net, trying to find her place in a country upended by war. She got a job at the Post Exchange at Camp Cook, a military base in Lompoc. It was here, surrounded by soldiers, that she was crowned Camp Cutie, a small, sweet taste of the admiration she craved. It was also here that she was arrested for underage drinking in September 1943, an incident that resulted in the mugshot and fingerprints that would later identify her body. As a minor, she was sent back to Medford by the juvenile authorities, but she wouldn't stay. The pull of a life less ordinary was too strong. She soon relocated to Florida, following the migratory patterns of so many young people during the war. It was there that she met the great love of her life, Major Matthew Michael Gordon, Jr. He was a decorated pilot in the Army Air Forces, a flying ace assigned to the 2nd Air Commando Group. He was handsome, brave, and by all accounts, deeply in love with Elizabeth. They corresponded frequently while he was stationed overseas in the perilous China-Burma-India theater of war. In his letters, he proposed marriage. For Elizabeth, this was the ultimate dream come to life. Not fame, but love, stability, and a family of her own. She accepted his proposal with joy. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed her restless search was over. Her future was secure. Then, the cruelest of tragedies struck. In August of 1945, just days before Japan's surrender would have ended the war, Major Gordon's P-51 Mustang crashed in India. He was killed. The news, delivered in a cold, official telegram, shattered Elizabeth's world. The future she had so carefully constructed in her mind had vanished in a plume of smoke on the other side of the globe. Her friends would later say that something essential in her changed after Matt Gordon's death. The light in her eyes dimmed. She became more melancholic, more withdrawn. She began to wear black clothing almost exclusively, a public performance of her private grief. It was this habit, combined with her dark hair, that would eventually contribute to her infamous nickname. In a heartbreaking attempt to keep her dream alive, she began to tell people that she and Matt had been married and had a child who died in infancy. It was a fantasy, a shield built of words to protect a heart that had been utterly broken. It was the story of the life she felt was stolen from her. In the summer of 1946, she made her final journey to Southern California. She was 22 years old, a war widow in spirit, if not in fact. Her dream of becoming a movie star was still alive, however faint. But Hollywood is a brutal, unforgiving town. It's a place that runs on connections and currency, and Elizabeth had neither. She drifted on the periphery of the Hollywood scene, a familiar face in the coffee shops and diners along Hollywood Boulevard and Vine Street. She was often broke, relying on the kindness of acquaintances and the occasional $10 or $20 wired from her long-suffering mother back in Medford. She dated many men, mostly servicemen, but these relationships were often fleeting and transactional in the most basic sense. A date often meant a good meal, a movie, and a temporary escape from loneliness. The press would later seize upon this, twisting her story into a dark morality tale. They cast her as a promiscuous, amoral teaser, a b-girl who traded companionship for meals and a place to stay. But those who actually knew her painted a different picture. They described a young woman who was sweet but profoundly sad, a little naive, who talked more about getting married and settling down than about fame and fortune. She rarely drank alcohol, and according to the later autopsy report and accounts from friends, may have suffered from a congenital genital abnormality, often referred to as infantile genitalia, that would have made sexual intercourse painful, if not impossible. The image of the seductive party girl, the femme fatale, was a convenient and sensational fiction. It sold newspapers, and, crucially, it allowed the public to feel a little less sympathy for the victim. The last few weeks of her life are a murky collage of sightings and conflicting reports. a timeline pieced together by detectives after the fact. In December 1946, she was in San Diego, staying with a family named the Frenches. She seemed restless, unhappy. She met Robert "Red" Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman. They began a brief platonic relationship. On January 8, 1947, Manley agreed to drive her back to Los Angeles. On January 9th, he dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in the heart of downtown L.A. She told him she was going to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston. This was another one of her fictions. Her sister was thousands of miles away. Elizabeth Short walked into the grand, opulent lobby of the Biltmore Hotel, a place that symbolized the glamour she sought, and then she vanished. For 6 full days, she existed in a void. No one knows for certain where she went, who she was with, or what horrors she endured during that time. These 6 days are known as her missing week. When she was next seen, she was no longer Elizabeth Short. She was a body in a vacant lot on Norton Avenue, a gruesome tableau arranged for the world to see. The crime scene itself was the first chapter in the anatomy of an investigative failure. When the first LAPD officers arrived, they found a scene of breathtaking, methodical brutality. The victim's body was severed at the waist with an almost surgical precision, a technique known in the medical world as a hemicorporectomy. She had been completely drained of blood, a process called exsanguination, which left her skin a waxy, marble-like white. Her body was immaculately clean, scrubbed of any trace evidence. She was posed almost deliberately. Her arms were raised above her head, her elbows bent at right angles. Her legs were spread apart in a vulgar display. But the most horrific injury was to her face. The killer had taken a knife and carved a grotesque ear-to-ear smile into her cheeks, a wound that would become infamously known as a Glasgow smile. There were other marks of torture. Ligature marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck indicated she had been bound and possibly strangled. There were cuts and bruises all over her body. A chunk of flesh had been carved from her thigh, and a crude rose tattoo had been excised. This was not a crime of passion. This was a ritualistic, sadistic display of complete dominance. The cleanliness of the body and the absolute lack of blood at the scene proved she was not killed there. She was murdered elsewhere, in a private, controlled environment, possibly over a period of hours or even days. Her body was then meticulously dissected and cleaned before being transported to the vacant lot to be found. The killer wanted her to be a spectacle. The police response, however, was immediately and irrevocably chaotic. The Los Angeles Police Department of 1947 was an organization riddled with corruption and infighting. Before the lead investigators from the Homicide Division, Sergeants Harry Hansen and Finis Brown, could properly secure the area, a swarm of reporters and curious onlookers descended upon the lot like vultures. Dozens of people, journalists and civilians alike, trampled over potential evidence, footprints, tire tracks, anything that might have told a story. One reporter from the Los Angeles Examiner, part of William Randolph Hearst's powerful media empire, even reached into a public phone booth nearby, found a purse and a shoe believed to be Elizabeth's, and pocketed them before notifying the police. The crime scene was contaminated beyond salvation from the very beginning. Identifying the victim was the first hurdle. Her face was battered, her body mutilated. But the police had her fingerprints. In a moment of technological novelty, the prints were sent to the FBI in Washington, D.C. via a sound photo machine, which transmitted images over telephone wires. The response came back quickly. The prints matched those on file for a 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara for underage drinking, Elizabeth Short. Once her name was released, The media frenzy exploded into a full-blown inferno. The competition between the city's numerous daily papers was cutthroat, and reporters would do almost anything for a scoop. Examiner journalists tracked down Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, in Massachusetts. In an act of staggering cruelty, they told her that her daughter had won a beauty contest. They coaxed personal details, stories, and precious family photos from the unsuspecting mother before finally revealing the horrifying truth. Elizabeth was dead. The Examiner then flew Phoebe out to Los Angeles, ostensibly to help the police with the investigation, but in reality to keep her under their exclusive control, sequestering her in a hotel room to milk her for every drop of grief-stricken copy. It was the press that gave her the name that would make her immortal. In the winter of 1946, the film noir The Blue Dahlia, starring Veronica Lake and Alan Ladd, was a box office hit. Lake, with her famous peekaboo hairstyle, had dark hair, much like Elizabeth. In the weeks leading up to her death, patrons at a local drugstore in Long Beach had apparently nicknamed Elizabeth the Black Dahlia because of her dark hair and her habit of wearing black dresses. A reporter overheard this, and the name was simply too good to pass up. It was cinematic, mysterious, and alluring. Elizabeth Short, the waitress from Medford with asthma, ceased to exist. In her place was born the Black Dahlia, a creature of celluloid and shadow. This act of naming was the first crucial step in building the myth. It separated the victim from her humanity, reframing her as a character in a real-life noir film that the entire city was watching, transfixed in horror and fascination. The investigation quickly became one of the largest and most public in LAPD history. Thousands of man-hours were spent chasing down leads, many of which were generated by the sensationalist and often entirely fabricated newspaper coverage. The police were overwhelmed. They interviewed hundreds of men Elizabeth had known or casually dated. They scoured her known hangouts. But the killer had been chillingly careful. There was no physical evidence at the dump site, and the missing week offered a black hole of possibilities. The police were working in a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed speculation, rumor, and outright fabrication. The newspapers printed stories suggesting she was a call girl, a lesbian, a pawn in a blackmail scheme. None of these claims were ever substantiated. But they sold papers and painted a picture of a victim who had somehow brought this fate upon herself, a common and cruel trope in cases involving female victims. Then, on January 24th, 9 days after the discovery of the body, the killer made contact, escalating the case from a murder mystery to a public spectacle of terror. A manila envelope arrived at the office of the Los Angeles Examiner. It was addressed using words cut and pasted from movie ads and newspapers, a classic trope of pulp fiction brought to life. Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, her birth certificate, social security card, business cards, and cherished photographs. There was also an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The entire package had been carefully wiped clean with gasoline, erasing any potential fingerprints, but leaving behind a distinct, volatile scent. The message was a clear and arrogant taunt. This was the killer, proving he had possession of her things, and proving he was smarter than the police. Shortly after, a handwritten note arrived, also at the Examiner. It read, "Here it is, turning in Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun with police. Black Dahlia Avenger. The sender promised to turn himself in, but of course he never did." A series of other letters followed, a disjointed and cryptic correspondence from someone claiming to be the killer. The handwriting was erratic, the tone mocking and theatrical. One letter contained a chilling message. "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." The police and FBI handwriting experts examined the notes, but they led nowhere. Was it the real killer, playing a deadly cat-and-mouse game with the entire city, or was it a cruel prankster, a gatecrasher to a tragedy, inserting themselves into the biggest story in the country? To this day, no one is sure. The investigation's anatomy reveals a fatal flaw. It was drowning in information, most of it useless. The unprecedented publicity generated a bizarre and uniquely American phenomenon. A wave of false confessions. Over the course of the active investigation, more than 60 people, mostly men, confessed to the murder of Elizabeth Short. Each one had to be thoroughly investigated, their stories checked, their alibis confirmed. It was a colossal waste of time and resources. The psychology is complex. Some were mentally ill, delusional individuals who had absorbed the media reports and convinced themselves of their own guilt. Others were desperate for attention, pathetic figures seeking a moment in the spotlight, even if it meant being known as a brutal murderer. One man, a 29-year-old Army corporal named Joseph DeMay, confessed in such detail that police briefly thought they had their man, only for his entire story to be revealed as a fabrication. He was stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey, at the time of the murder. This torrent of false leads diverted attention. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the case grew colder. The LAPD officially never closed the investigation, but active leads dried up. The Black Dahlia case became a part of the city's folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers about the dark side of the Hollywood dream. And with no official resolution, the case became a canvas onto which countless theories could be projected. The number of potential suspects is staggering. A veritable rogues gallery of characters from every corner of Los Angeles society. Dissecting the most prominent of these theories is crucial to understanding the anatomy of this enduring mystery. One of the earliest and most scrutinized suspects was Mark Hansen, the Danish-born nightclub and movie theater owner whose name was on the address book sent to the newspaper. Elizabeth had stayed briefly in a room at his home on Carlos Avenue, which he often let out to young, aspiring actresses. Hansen was a powerful and well-connected figure in the Hollywood nightlife scene, but also a man with a reputation. The theory, then and now, is that he was romantically obsessed with Elizabeth, that she rejected his advances, and that this rejection spiraled into a violent rage. Some have suggested he was involved in a blackmail ring, and that Elizabeth knew too much. Police investigated Hansen thoroughly. They questioned him multiple times and searched his home. They found a mattress with what appeared to be bloodstains, but in the days before DNA testing, nothing could be definitively proven. Hansen had a solid alibi for the time of the murder and passed a polygraph test. While he remained a person of interest for many, the police could never find concrete evidence to link him to the crime. Another bizarre and intriguing line of inquiry centered on a man named Leslie Dillon. Dillon was a 27-year-old former bellhop and aspiring writer who became embroiled in the case through a Los Angeles psychiatrist, Dr. Paul DeGaston. DeGaston contacted the police with a startling claim. One of his patients, Dillon, knew intimate details about the murder that had not been made public. He suggested Dillon might have been an accomplice to the real killer, a man he called Jeff Connors. This led to a strange, almost comical episode where the police tried to orchestrate a psycho-out, placing Dillon in a hotel room with a hidden microphone, hoping he would confess to a planted informant. The plan failed spectacularly. Dillon seemed to know he was being watched. He was held as a material witness for several days, but was eventually released due to a lack of evidence. The Jeff Connors he mentioned was never proven to exist. Was Dillon a disturbed individual with a morbid fascination for the case, or was he a killer who managed to outsmart the police? Like so many threads in this case, his story simply unraveled into nothing. For decades, these and other theories languished in the realm of speculation. The case files gathered dust. The Dahlia became more ghost than cold case. Then, at the turn of the 21st century, a new and explosive theory emerged, one that would captivate a new generation of true crime enthusiasts. This theory came not from a journalist or a novelist, but from a retired LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hodel, and the suspect he identified was a man he knew intimately, his own father, Dr. George Hill Hodel. George Hodel was, on the surface, a man of immense intellect and culture. A child prodigy with a genius-level IQ, he was a respected physician specializing in venereal diseases. He moved in elite Hollywood circles, and his distinctive Mayan Revival home in Hollywood, the Soden House, was a salon for artists and intellectuals. He counted figures like the surrealist artist Man Ray and the director John Huston among his friends. But beneath this veneer of sophistication lay a dark and depraved secret life. Hodel was a man with a penchant for lavish parties that descended into drunken orgies, a fascination with surrealist art that often depicted dismembered female bodies, and a history of disturbing sexual allegations. In 1945, he had been a prime suspect in the death of his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, from a supposed drug overdose, but the case was never prosecuted. Most damningly, in 1949, his own 14-year-old daughter, Tamar, accused him of incest. Hodel was arrested and put on trial. It was a media sensation, but soon after, he abruptly moved his family out of the country, living abroad for the next 40 years, effectively disappearing. Steve Hodel had grown up largely estranged from his father. After George's death in 1999, Steve was going through his father's possessions when he found a small photo album. Inside were 2 pictures of a dark-haired woman. Steve, a trained homicide detective, was struck by her resemblance to Elizabeth Short. This discovery sent him on a years-long, obsessive investigation into his father's past. The evidence he compiled is extensive, and to many, highly compelling. He argues that his father, with his surgical skills, was one of the few people capable of performing the precise bisection of Elizabeth's body. He unearthed secret LAPD surveillance files from 1950. The police, suspecting Hodel in the Dahlia murder and other crimes, had bugged his home. The transcripts recorded George Hodel saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Furthermore, Steve Hodel hired renowned handwriting experts who concluded that his father's handwriting was a likely match for the taunting notes sent by the Black Dahlia Avenger. He points to his father's deep connection to surrealism, particularly his friendship with Man Ray. He argues that the posing of Elizabeth Short's body was a grotesque work of performance art, a real-life homage to Man Ray's famous photograph Minotaur, which depicts a woman's bisected torso. The theory is a sprawling, intricate web connecting George Hodel, not just to the Dahlia murder, but to a string of other unsolved killings in Los Angeles from the same era, painting him as a prolific, sadistic serial killer who used his intellect and social standing to evade justice for decades. In 2013, Steve Hodel brought a cadaver dog named Buster to the basement of the Soden house. The dog, trained to detect the unique chemical signature of human decomposition, gave multiple alerts, suggesting a dead body may have been present there. Soil samples, however, were inconclusive. Critics of the George Hodel theory point to this lack of definitive forensic evidence. They argue Steve Hodel is too close to the subject, prone to confirmation bias. They point out that handwriting analysis is subjective, and the bugging transcripts are not a clear confession, yet the circumstantial evidence is powerful. The Los Angeles County District Attorney at the time, Steve Cooley, stated publicly that the case against George Hodel was very compelling. The Hodel theory is perhaps the closest we have ever come to a satisfying answer. It provides a killer with the means, motive, and opportunity. But it is not the only plausible theory to have re-emerged. Another compelling suspect is Dr. Walter Bailey, a surgeon who lived just 1 block from the lot where Elizabeth's body was discovered. Bailey's daughter was a childhood friend of Elizabeth's younger sister. Author Pugh Eatwell, in her book Black Dahlia, Red Rose, presents a detailed case against Bailey, suggesting he was part of a corrupt circle that included Mark Hansen. She posits that Elizabeth was likely killed accidentally at Hansen's home or a related property during a party, possibly after being drugged, and that Bailey was called in to dispose of the body. His surgical skills would account for the bisection. The mutilations would have been a desperate attempt to obscure her identity. Supporting this theory is the fact that Bailey was suffering from a degenerative brain disease that could have caused violent, unpredictable behavior. And his death in 1948, just a year after the murder, meant he could never be properly questioned by a newly focused police force. And so we are left where we began, with a ghost. The true anatomy of this case is not just the study of a crime, but the study of a cultural phenomenon. The Black Dahlia murder occurred at a unique intersection of time and place. Post-war Los Angeles was a city in transition, a place of immense glamour and deep-seated corruption. The LAPD of the 1940s was notoriously compromised. The newspaper business was at its zenith, a ruthless, ink-stained world where truth was often secondary to a sensational headline. And Hollywood was the ultimate dream factory, a place that manufactured myths for a living. Into this perfect storm walked Elizabeth Short, a young woman who was herself a product of that dream factory's promise. When she was murdered so horrifically, she became a blank screen onto which the city could project all of its deepest fears and darkest fantasies. She was the innocent girl corrupted by the big city. She was the promiscuous femme fatale who got what was coming to her. She was the tragic victim of a sadistic monster. She was all of these things, and none of them. The myth-making machine, powered by the police, the press, and the public, ground her up and reassembled her into something she never was. The dozens of false confessions were not just a distraction for the police. They were a symptom of a society desperate to be part of the story, to touch the darkness, to have a role in the real-life movie unfolding in the headlines. The endless parade of suspects, from shady nightclub owners to brilliant, evil doctors, only adds to the myth's power. Each theory provides a different kind of monster, a different flavor of fear. The lack of a definitive answer means the story can be endlessly retold, reinterpreted, and reshaped to fit the anxieties of any given era. It has become a modern American folktale, a cautionary story about the price of fame and the darkness that lurks beneath the sunny facade of the American dream. The ultimate tragedy of the Black Dahlia is not just that her killer was never caught. It is that in the process of becoming an immortal legend, the real Elizabeth Short was almost entirely erased. We remember the gruesome details of her death, the Glasgow smile, the bisected body. We remember the mysterious name and the no-Irish glamour that has been retroactively applied to her life. But we forget the girl from Medford with the bad lungs who loved a pilot killed in the war. We forget the daughter who wrote letters home asking for money, who dreamed not just of stardom, but of a husband and a family. We forget the human being, a 22-year-old woman lost in a big city, whose life was defined not by its lurid end, but by its quiet, desperate, and ultimately unfulfilled search for a place to belong. The anatomy of this modern myth is built upon a foundation of her stolen humanity. The investigation failed not only to find her killer, but also to protect her memory. The press, in its hunger for a story, cannibalized her life and turned her into a caricature. And we, the public, have remained complicit, consuming the grisly details as entertainment, turning a real woman's suffering into a puzzle to be solved on a podcast or a documentary to be watched on a quiet night. We are fascinated by the darkness of her death, but have been largely indifferent to the light of her life. 75 years later, the weeds have long since been cleared from the lot on Norton Avenue. Houses stand there now, inhabited by families who may not even know the history of the ground beneath their feet. But the ghost of Elizabeth Short remains. She haunts Los Angeles, a permanent fixture in the city's psychic landscape. Her case will likely never be officially solved. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The secrets buried with the suspects. All that is left is the story. A story that has grown so large and so powerful that it has completely overshadowed the truth. The final, brutal act of violence committed against Elizabeth Short was not the severing of her body, but the erasure of her soul, replacing a person with a permanent, unsolvable, and endlessly fascinating myth. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.